The cinema is where we go to lose ourselves in other realities. But what happens when the lights go out and the reality around you starts to distort? When reflections on the screen show shadows that shouldn't be there, and movie sounds come to life in an empty theater. Today, I bring you 4 stories of people who discovered that. In the darkness of a movie theater, the most terrifying show isn't always on the screen. Sometimes it's sitting right next to you. Turn off your phone, stay quiet, and get ready, because the feature is about to begin. I've always liked going to the movies alone. There's something strangely relaxing about the darkness and the smell of stale popcorn. Last Tuesday, I decided to go to the late-night screening of an independent horror film at the old downtown cinema, one of those places that still has red velvet curtains and creaky wooden seats. When I entered Theater 4, I realized it was almost deserted. There was only one person, a man, sitting about 6 rows behind me, completely motionless, eyes fixed on the still blank screen. I sat in my usual spot, right in the center, and waited for the trailers to start. Before the movie began, there was a moment of absolute silence. The giant screen, though off, acted like a dark mirror due to the dim light from the emergency exits. Out of pure boredom, I stared at my own reflection up there. I could see myself, and a few rows back, I could distinguish the blurry silhouette of the other man. But then, my eyes focused better. In the screen's reflection, the man wasn't alone. There were other silhouettes sitting next to him, and others scattered throughout the theater. They were dense, dark shadows that seemed to occupy almost every seat in the back row. The most unsettling part was that when I physically turned my head to look back, the theater was empty. It was just him and me. I looked back at the screen. In the reflection, the shadows were no longer sitting. Every single one of them had stood up at the same time and was staring intently toward my row. My heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, those silhouettes had no faces. They were just black voids contrasting with the red exit light. The worst part was seeing them start to move. In the reflection, the shadows jumped from row to row, advancing forward, closing the distance between them and my seat. But every time I turned my head toward the real theater, I only saw the red seats, empty and silent. Suddenly the projectors flickered on. The white light of the film flooded the room, and the surround sound roared, breaking the silence. For a second, I felt relieved. With the light of the image, the reflection vanished. I tried to focus on the movie, but the air in the room grew heavy, thick with the smell of old dust and something metallic. Then I felt a slight brush. It was barely a whisper of fabric against my shoulder, as if someone had just sat down right next to me. I froze, eyes fixed on the screen, not daring to look to my right. That's when the movie hit a scene of total darkness, leaving the screen black for a few seconds. The reflection returned. There they were. On the screen, I saw that my row was full. One of those shadows was sitting right beside me, leaning toward me, as if whispering something into my ear. The man in the back row, the only other real human, suddenly bolted and ran out of the theater without looking back, leaving the door swinging open. I didn't wait to see more. I stood up, tripping over my own legs. As I ran down the aisle toward the exit, I felt the seats in my path fold and unfold on their own, as if an invisible crowd was standing up to follow me. I never looked back at the screen. Since that day, I only watch movies at home. I can't stand the thought of looking at a reflection and discovering that, even if I can't see them, the seats around me are never empty. Working maintenance at a cinema after the last screening ends has its perks. The silence is absolute. and the empty building feels like it's yours alone. Or at least I thought so, until I was assigned the deep cleaning of Theatre 9. It was 2:30 a.m. Management had already shut down the projectors and the main sound system. I was walking down the center aisle with my cleaning cart when, passing in front of the heavy door of Theatre 9, I heard something that shouldn't have been there. It was music, a slow, distorted piano melody, as if coming from an old tape. I opened the door, expecting to find some teenager hiding or a projector left on by mistake, but the room was in total darkness. The screen was a grey, empty wall. However, the sound didn't stop. On the contrary, it became more complex. I started hearing dialogue, footsteps over dry leaves, and a child crying. The unsettling part wasn't just the volume, but that the sound wasn't coming from the wall speakers. The audio seemed to float in the air, moving from one corner of the room to another, as if the movie were playing in an invisible dimension. I approached the front rows, intrigued, and that's when the audio changed its tone. The child's crying stopped abruptly and was replaced by violent static. Amidst that noise, I heard my own name being pronounced by a voice that sounded like it was being played in reverse. I froze. In a room with no movie, no light, and no people, the cinema was playing something that only I could hear. I stood motionless in the middle of the aisle. The static ceased and gave way to a deathly silence, but it only lasted a few seconds. Suddenly, the room's surround sound system, which I knew was disconnected, emitted a metallic crash, as if thousands of coins were falling from the ceiling to the floor. I started walking toward the exit, but the sound blocked me. I heard heavy footsteps, like military boots, running through the rows from top to bottom, approaching at high speed. The most terrifying thing was that I saw no one. I only heard how the leather seats sank and creaked under the weight of that invisible presence. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice was trembling. The answer wasn't a voice, but the sound of a film being rewound at full speed directly into my ears. The hum was so sharp it forced me to cover my ears and fall to my knees. In that state, with my eyes closed, the sound became hyper-realistic. I felt a hand brush against my back and the sound of someone breathing heavily just behind my neck. "Cut the audio," a guttural voice whispered, not from the speakers, but as if it were coming from inside my own head. At that instant, all the emergency lights in the room flickered and died. In total darkness, I heard one last sound, that of a celluloid film burning, that characteristic bubbling of melting plastic. I stumbled out of the theater, guiding myself only by touch. The next day, the manager checked the system. There was no power in Theatre 9. The cables were disconnected, and the central server had been off all night. However, when I checked my uniform upon arriving home, I found a small piece of 35mm film strip stuck to my shoulder. It was charred at the edges, and when I held it up to the light, I saw only one frame, an image of a man from behind, kneeling in the middle of an empty movie theater, in the exact same position I had been in. I've been working as a shift manager at the city's largest cinema complex for 2 years. It's a predictable job until customers start complaining about things that make no sense. The first time was on a Friday night. A couple walked out of Theatre 6, complaining that an usher had rudely forced them to change seats. "He told us those seats were already taken," the man said, annoyed. "But the theater is half empty. Besides, his uniform is really weird." I apologized and asked for a description of the employee. They said he was a tall, very thin man wearing a red gala uniform with gold buttons. the kind they used back in the 1950s. I thought it was a joke, or that one of the cleaning crew had found a costume, since our current uniform is just a simple blue polo shirt. The next night, it happened again. A woman came out of Theater 2 crying. She said an usher had approached her in the dark and whispered in her ear to keep quiet, or he'd have to remove her from the screening. When I asked for a description, she mentioned the red suit with gold buttons and added a detail that made my skin crawl. The man had no eyes, only deep sockets hidden by the shadow of his peaked cap. I checked the security cameras in the hallways. I saw the woman running out of the theater, but when I rewound to see who had followed her or who was inside before her, I saw no one. The theater door would open on its own, and a second later, she would sprint out in terror. According to the camera, there was no employee in a red suit, but customers swore they felt the touch of his white gloves on their shoulders. I decided I couldn't ignore another complaint. That same night, after the last show in Theater 2 ended, I went in alone before the cleaning crew arrived. I sat in the last row, right where the woman had her encounter, and turned off my flashlight. The silence was so thick I could hear the hum of my own breathing. "Is anyone here?" I asked quietly. "The shift is over. You can come out." Suddenly, I felt a drop in temperature. A freezing draft, smelling of mothballs and old tobacco smoke, filled the room. Then, I heard footsteps. They weren't normal steps. It was the sound of patent leather shoes rhythmically hitting the carpeted floor. Tap, tap, tap. The steps stopped right next to me. I didn't want to look, but curiosity won. I turned my head slowly. At first I saw nothing, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I made out a silhouette. It was a man standing in the aisle in an impeccable red uniform with buttons that glowed with a dull, dying light. His cap was so low I could only see a pale, fixed smile. With a mechanical motion, he raised a gloved hand and pointed toward the empty screen. "The show never ends for those who stay," he said, in a voice that sounded like sandpaper rubbing together. I felt a cold pressure on my shoulder, as if long fingers were squeezing my bone. I bolted from the seat and ran to the projection booth to turn on every light in the room. When the white lights came on, the theater was empty. There was no trace of the man. The next day, I checked the building's historical archives. I discovered that in 1954, the original cinema on this lot suffered a fire during a gala screening. The head usher died trapped while trying to force people to maintain order instead of fleeing. In the newspaper photo, there he was, red suit, gold buttons, and that same fixed smile. The most terrifying thing wasn't the photo, but that when I reviewed the security footage of my inspection from the night before, I saw myself sitting alone, but my right shoulder was slumped down as if someone were leaning their entire weight on me. It was nearly 3 a.m., and my only task was to shut down the servers in Theater 1. It's the oldest room in the complex, with high ceilings and acoustics that sometimes play tricks on you. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the sound of an action scene, the thunder of a car crash, followed by a woman's scream and the sound of shattering glass. It struck me as odd because I had personally issued the shutdown order from the central hub 10 minutes prior. I entered the room expecting to see the screen on, but it was pitch black. However, the audio kept playing with terrifying clarity. Crash, screams, shattering glass. I waited for the scene to progress, but 3 seconds later, it started over. Crash, scream, shattering glass. It was a perfect loop. I walked up to the projection booth to see if the system had glitched, But when I got there, the door was locked and the projector was cold and disconnected. I looked down at the empty theater through the small booth window, and what I saw froze my blood. Every time the crash sounded, one of the seats in the front row would shake violently, as if something heavy was slamming into it. The most disturbing part was that, on the 5th repetition, the woman's scream changed. It was no longer part of a movie. This time the voice screamed my name. Panic made me rush down the booth stairs. I wanted to get out of that building as fast as possible. When I reached the theater floor, the loop stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a silence that pressed against my eardrums. I ran to the emergency exit, pushed it hard, and stepped through, expecting to see the lit parking lot. But I wasn't outside. As I crossed the door, I peered back at the top of the stairs at the very same Theater 1. Confused, and with my heart racing a mile a minute, I ran down again and dashed for the other exit leading to the lobby. Upon crossing it, the result was the same. I appeared entering through the back door of the theater. I was trapped in a geometrically impossible space. I looked at the screen. It wasn't black anymore. It had a grayish, grainy glow. On it, an image began to play. It was me, seen from above, running desperately from one door to another. In the movie, I stopped and looked at the camera in terror. In real life, I did the same. Then, the sound loop returned, but this time at an ear-splitting volume. Crash, scream, shattering glass. With every impact, the image on the screen distorted further, and I felt a stabbing pain in my chest, as if my own body was suffering the crash from the film. I realized the room wouldn't let me leave because I had become part of the footage. In an act of desperation, I ran toward the screen and tore through it with my hands, ripping the white canvas. I fell to the floor in total darkness. When I woke up, it was 7 a.m., and the morning shift crew was helping me up. I was lying behind the screen in the speaker gap. They told me they had found me unconscious and that the screen was torn from top to bottom. I quit that same day. Sometimes, I pass by the cinema and see that Theater 1 is still closed for repairs. I know the truth. They are still trying to erase my image from the film. Because every night at 3 a.m., I know my celluloid self is still running toward an exit it will never find. The next time you're at the movies and feel a sudden chill, or hear a whisper that doesn't come from the speakers, don't look back. Some stories refuse to leave the theater when the credits roll, and some viewers never manage to find the exit. If you've ever had a strange experience in an old theater or at a midnight screening, tell me about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more tales of insomnia. And remember, before you leave the theater, make sure your reflection follows you.